Hi everyone, this is Brian Hayes and welcome to episode 1 of a great new podcast series that I'll be hosting called The Music Mind. In this series, I'll get the opportunity to do deep dives into the creative minds of some of the best musicians you will ever hear in the world. I couldn't be more excited than to bring my first guest to you. This is the great Mike Hayes, my older brother, 64 years of age as we record this. But I want to let you hear how Mike played more than 35 years ago on this sizzling hot, white hot rock guitar solo from a song that Mike and I co-composed called Fat Cat. Check out Mike in his 20s, absolutely sizzling on the electric lead guitar. Well, hi Mike, and welcome to the Music Mind podcast. That was an amazing solo there. This was the guitar you played it on. What do you remember about recording that Fat Cat solo?
Well, it's a pretty cool song. I remember the background sort of a hard industrial type of sound, and I really thought about it as like a police car chase, right? Like I'm just imagining like this down all these streets with rain and all sorts of stuff pouring down there, and that was what I was trying to get. It's really like a picture. I'm not thinking about playing scales or anything like that. I just want to try and get that urgency. There's just one chord in the whole background. It's just E7.
Yeah.
So.
And I think listening to it, what I pick up is just that definition in your mind of the notes. Like there's so many people over the years, and particularly nowadays, it's still there. If you go into the local music shop, there's someone shredding on the guitar. But when I listen back to that solo, every note sounded like you intended that note. It didn't sound like... Was it improvised at the time in your mind, or had you sort of...
basically improvised. I mean, really, for me, with a lot of these things, I've played all those notes before, but I hadn't put them together in that order.
Yeah.
And, I'm always thinking of melodies, and that... Even though that's a sort of quite an angular sort of guitar sound, that's what I felt it needed, really.
Yeah. And the interesting thing just on guitar sound, one thing I've always loved about your playing is you've got your own sound, even though this is an electric guitar and this is your Bill Lawrence guitar, which was yours at the time, but it's now mine. We've chopped and changed a bit with the gear, and it's modified quite a little bit from when you recorded it. But when we listen back to that Fat Cat sound, your guitar sound, there wasn't too many effects on it. Do you remember what sort of effects you had when you played that on it?
I think I played it through the Rockman Sustainer, which was released in about 1985, and that would have went through a little bit of chorus as well. And I think probably the chorus is probably on one of the Roland DP5s or something like that. But
it's a pretty pure sound. I think particularly,
basic,
particularly on the electric guitar, it's hard to, or I believe it's hard to find your voice on the electric guitar. But you've never had that problem. You always sound like you when you're playing, no matter what the guitar you're playing. The other thing that I love in your playing is those massive bends, which is a part of your playing, and anyone who is a guitar player will know that it's hard to pull a bend up into tune, and particularly those tone and two-tone bends you do. They've been part of your playing for a very long time. What are you thinking about when you do those, almost like a trombone, saxophone, a wind instrument type bend, or a vocalist bend? What are you thinking of when you incorporate those into your playing?
Yeah, it's really like that. It's more like a trumpet. I'm trying to get like a trumpet with that type of force behind it, and not really a guitar.
And I think that's the one comment that I hear in your playing, and certainly our listeners today are going to hear you play in a whole lot of different styles over a lot of different eras, but you actually sound like you, and you really, to my mind, don't sound like a guitar, or as if you're not thinking of a guitar sound most often when you're playing? What are you thinking of? And I know it would change on the song, but I'm sure our listeners will be intrigued about how you've developed your own sound. So what do you think of sound-wise when you're playing?
Well, of course, I love the sound of a guitar. I'm absolutely in love with the sound of a guitar. But it's very rare indeed that I'm thinking like a guitar player. I'm hearing sounds in my head, and I'm trying to get that. If it's a jazz type of sound, I'm thinking of somebody like Bob Venier. And
Yep.
of course, and that's where my tone goes. Obviously, I can't play like Bob at all, but if I've got audio reference points in my mind, and if I'm thinking of Bob Venier, obviously I'm in down the Marvin Stamm,
Yep.
Clifford Brown type of tone. And I think that's the thing. If you've got the tone in your head, you'll work out how to get it. Like when you could throw me a guitar, and I'd still find out how to get that sound. And it wouldn't be like from an equipment. I wouldn't worry about, whether the tone is on this or the treble. I'd soon just do a couple of tweaks, but it's really, I feel, what you hear in your head, and then you've got to find some way of getting it out. And I think the trick is the music will tell you what to play. Getting back to the Fat Cat solo, the music told me what to play there. It's my response, my reaction to the sounds I'd hear in the background.
Yeah, and just for our viewers, Bob Venier is a great Australian trumpet and flugelhorn player. We met Bob in Melbourne many years ago, and we'll talk more about that later. We might just throw up a quick image of Bob here, an amazing flugelhorn player. He played the famous solo for the Little River Band's Reminiscing, which I understand was the most played song on US radio for about a decade. So Bob, in his own way, has probably been heard by more people than any other flugelhorn player. And certainly the trip to Melbourne where we met Bob and Bruce Clark and a whole lot of other amazing moments. We'll talk about that. No doubt that influenced you. But from my perspective, I was here when you recorded Fat Cat. Fat Cat was a song we wrote together.
Right,
we played all of the instruments. We did the arrangements together. From memory, I think we split up the duties that you played all of the guitars and all of the percussion programming, and I played the saxophones and the keyboards, including the keyboard bass. So it was actually recorded in this very room. This is the original B&M Studios, and in fact I remember Mike playing that solo, standing about probably 6 or 7 feet to his right, and I was mixing the sound at the time Mike played it, and from memory that was a first take solo. So my memory of Mike's playing in that era, and we're talking 35 to 40 years ago, is that he very much was a one-hit wonder. When you'd hit the play and record, he'd just nail his solos on the first attempt. What's your thoughts on that, Mike? My experience has been, whenever I've tried to record something, that if I don't get it right on the first go, or certainly on the second go, I just walk away from it.
Agreed.
What's your views on that? Yeah,
absolutely, mate. As soon if you don't get that, because that's what you want. I mean, to me, originally the whole idea with recording was to capture an event.
Yes.
And over time, I feel it's went to more like it's trying to create an event. And it's like, if you can't get it the first take, or definitely if you can't get the second take, you start labouring over it, and then you start thinking about it. And I really think if you're doing improvisation, you want to suspend judgment. You just really want to respond and be in the moment. I don't think you want to be worrying about, gee, I want to play it like this.
I think that's great advice, and we're both music educators. We've taught people from all around the world, but the most common thing I say to my students is that music is, to me, it's just a conversation. And if you say something, we don't always get our conversations right, but if you've said something wrong or offended someone, you might have to go and apologise, but you never really retake a conversation.
No, that's right. And if we had a script for a conversation, it would come out very stilted. Like we're talking now at the moment about Fat Cat. I think, to use an analogy, if I suddenly started trotting off and saying, gee, the salad dressing was quite nice, you'd be wondering, like, where did Mike just go now? That's like when a guy learns a lick, and he's learned a lick in E7th, which is Fat Cat, and he's now going to try and insert it into that solo. Now, it's going to sound like the salad dressing quote, and it just never fits. So it's got to flow.
there's so many people who will watch this podcast and who will dream of being able to take a personalised red hot guitar solo or white hot guitar solo like you did in Fat Cat there. Is there a jelly bean or a pill that you can take that lets you play the guitar like that, or what's your advice?
No, I think really I tried to play like a lot of people when I started, and what really turned out to be my advantage, although it didn't seem like it at the time, that eventually I worked out that I couldn't play like any of them. Actually, I can't play like any guitar player, so that sorts that out.
Yeah.
But I can play like me, and it was a really difficult thing to get your head around at the time. Like I couldn't play like whoever it was, Larry Carlton or whatever, and I definitely can't. No way in the world. I've got no idea what Larry's doing. I could work out what he's doing, but it would never come out, even if I got it note for note. I could never sound like Larry Carlton.
So that's a really interesting point, because a lot of the music education over the last 20 or 30 years has been focused on, if you go to a music college or university music course, you study all the greats and you transcribe solos, and the thinking is that if you copy enough people, you'll end up sounding like yourself. But my experience at the output, the people when they come out of those courses, is that they all end up sounding largely like each other,
yes.
because they've done the same textbooks, they've practiced the same scales, they've played with each other. We're going to take you right back to your early beginnings now, and we'll throw up a photo here of the great Mike Hayes when he was 2 years old. So we've got that on the screen there. Mike, what's your memories of that little guy? What do you think of when you see that little guy at aged 2?
Well, really, that's how I am today, to be perfectly honest. Obviously, I'm a little bit bigger. I can't fit in that cute little shirt with the little bunnies on it. That's a problem. But apart from that, I've changed physically, obviously. But it's still really, I feel the same. I basically haven't grown up, which... that childlike approach to music. Obviously, at that stage, I had no idea about music and didn't even know I was going to get involved in music. But it's that that sort of approach to life. I'll just tell you a really funny little story while we're on about
absolutely.
that.
Yeah.
I was out shopping down the Brisbane Mall there one day. I was taking a break on a seat outside. I had some parcels there, and this lady came up to me, and she said, "Mike Hayes, you haven't changed a bit. Still free." And as she's coming up, I'm thinking, who is this person?
Yeah.
I'm thinking, is it a student? No, I don't recognise it. Is it a parent of the student? I'm still trying to think. But the takeaway was, what she said to me is still free. Now, I thought, actually, funnily enough, that's an interesting observation.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that's, I think, a large part of, like when I play or do something in music, I just try and be in that moment, and it's like another world. Like you open a door and you go into another world, and it's always gave me great comfort, this whole thing about music. So that was an interesting observation.
It is an interesting observation, and for our listeners, Mike really has lived the dream for what a lot of people who dream of spending their life involved in music. He's been a professional musician now for, 50 years? Pretty close to 50 years. He's one of the best you'll ever hear. I see in that photo, I love quotes, and if I had to put a quote there, I'd put one from the great John Fogerty from Creedence Clearwater Revival in a song he wrote long after he left Creedence called Centrefield. I just see on that, and I'll put it under the photo, "Put me in, coach, I'm ready to play." To me, that little guy's got that attitude. He's ready.
Yep.
And mate, over the years, my recollection is you've always been ready to play. You've had the skills under your belt to do the task that you had to do. So we'll just shift gears now a little bit and talk about the early years in Gympie, when Fender and Gibson were two words that were big in our minds. So, folks, we're here with two iconic brands of guitars. When Mike and I were growing up in the late 50s in Mike's case, and in the early 60s for me, the name Gibson and Fender were synonymous with I think for us kids in Gympie, the unattainable or the unreachable, what's your memory? What's your first memory of a guitar like this? This is a Gibson ES345. This is actually my guitar again, Mike. You keep nicking my guitars.
That's right. They're very nice, though.
But,
what other colours do they come in?
Yeah, I don't know. But you've had a long association in the early days with this type of guitar and with the brand Gibson. Tell us about your earliest memories of a Gibson guitar and what that meant for someone, a kid growing up in Gympie, which for our listeners, at the time Mike was born, had less than 10,000 people. Today, the Gympie region, it's based in southeast Queensland area, about a 2-hour drive from Brisbane, which is the 3rd largest city in Australia. Today, there's about 50,000 people living in the overall region. But when Mike hatched out here in Gympie, there was less than 10,000 people. It really was a small country town. So what's your earliest memories of the guitar and the brand that you're holding there?
Well, I first really saw this style of guitar, this Gibson style, in the back of it was an advert in Downbeat magazine that my first teacher had. And boy, did I absolutely look at that photo. I mean, I looked at it over and over and over and over and over, just sort of basically must have
burnt the ink off the page.
Honestly, yeah.
And what model was that?
It was the 355 Gibson, the model.
The BB King model.
BB King model, absolutely, yes. It had like the block inlays, whereas this got like split inlays, and the neck had all different sorts of binding. That was their top of the range in this thin line F-hole.
So this model guitar was probably most closely associated with Chuck Berry.
Oh, absolutely, Chuck Berry, definitely, yes, Chuck Berry. And the model basically below this in the range with the dot inlays is the 335, which is associated with Larry Carlton, Lee Ritenour, people like that. And,
so, you know, how old would have you been when you started poring over the Gibson catalogue with the photos of these instruments? What age?
Oh, look,
still at school, or had you left
no,
school?
Still at school. I got my guitar when I was 13 years. So it's my 13th birthday.
Just on that, so that was a tempo acoustic guitar, wasn't it?
Yes.
We haven't got a photo of Mike with that guitar, but we've got a photo of Mike and I, me, I'm the cute little fella in the shorts, and I'm holding Mike's original tempo guitar, and you had by that time somehow or other upgraded to a tempo electric guitar, again based off of this 335, 345 shape. What's the how do you remember going from the throwaway $15 acoustic tempo to your first electric? What was going on there?
Well, actually, it wasn't upmarket one. It was $17. It was the deluxe model. $17.
Well, your tempo actually was a good rip-off, I think, of these at the time. It was probably
the electric one. Sorry, yes. The acoustic one was $17 one, but I think the electric one was probably around $120. So it was a huge step up the thing. But what actually had happened, by the time I was 14 and a half, I was already playing in the Royal Mail Hotel in Noosa down that way, and definitely underage. They used to smuggle me in. Actually, Dad used to drive me down because he didn't have a licence or anything.
Yes, that's right.
And I'd back up these singers and that. And the deal was that I wasn't supposed to move off the stage because they'd notice that I'm underage, as if they wouldn't notice a 14-year-old kid anyway.
It was a different era, I think, in most places around the world. But so the electric came because you were starting to perform in places in groups, and obviously needed that.
After about 18 months, then the need come to be, or the opportunity, I should say, came to really play out. And of course, the acoustic guitar was not the instrument I needed for that.
No. And what about the brand Fender? I'm playing here a reissue of the original Fender 6-string bass, and it's a beautiful guitar. But the brand Fender was as distant for us, I think, as kids as Gibson. You couldn't. The local music store certainly didn't have a couple of Gibsons and a few Fenders for us to pick from. No. What's your earliest memory of the brand Fender in your life and in the Gympie area?
Well, same sort of situation. A Fender catalogue. I come across one of those. Not quite sure how. Maybe from a music store. I'm not sure how got a hold of that. But it had the whole range of all the Fender guitars through it, the amps and things like that, and in particular the Fender Stratocaster, one which I almost have the exact guitar that I was looking at today, which was one of my main guitars that I play all the time. The only difference was it had a maple neck, and the one I prefer at the moment has got a rosewood neck. But the only way you'd ever see these guitars was in the catalogue. You'd never see them live.
Yeah.
So these guitars might as well have been on the moon, really.
I remember, and I imagine our parents must have drove us, but there was a music store in Brisbane in the Valley called Harlequin Music.
Yeah.
And I can remember you and me just dribbling there, and I don't know what era, I think it was before we got ours or after, but it was a music store where they would have, you know, the BB King model, the model Mike's got now, and the 335. You'd walk in and there'd be 3 or 4 of this standard guitar up on the wall, and below that Fender Stratocasters and Telecasters. It was just, for 2 kids from the bush, it was unbelievable. And you know, the prices on the guitars, they might have well as been the price of a Rolls Royce. You know, we thought we had no chance of doing that. But I want to now, we've heard you play, Mike, in your 20s, 35 or 40 years ago, but part of the fun of recording this podcast is we've actually filmed a few videos, probably the first time we've been filmed in 20 or more years playing. And we filmed one where Mike was playing this Gibson and I played the Fender 6-string bass. We'll show it to you now. We just called this one the Gibson Fender Blues. And I think after you see this, one of the things with podcasts, often when we're talking to people who've got a bit of age on them, I'm now approaching 60 years of age, Mike is 64, that it's a bit of an old when we were good days discussion. It always worries me that the good old days, and I think the good old days were there, but today's pretty good too. And this is a chance to let everyone hear how Mike plays right now. This was filmed in June 2021. Have a listen and enjoy the Gibson Fender Blues. Well, I hope you enjoy that. Certainly, Mike, those fingers still seem to be working well, and the power bends and that sound we talked of before. I think it's important for everyone to know that while the Gibson ES345 style guitar was a big part of your early years, how long is it since you've actually played that style of guitar?
Probably well over 20 years. I just picked it up before.
And that's what I want to share with you, that in this podcast, that's not Mike's 10th go at that. These are first takes, and he's got a great sound on that guitar. It's a very different fretboard setup to the guitars that Mike normally plays, but the sound is with the player, not the instrument and not the equipment. That's my take. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I think just listening back to that tape, it still sounds like me. You can still tell that's how I play, and yeah, definitely a different feel than I'm used to. So, but yep, that's our first take on it. So,
and I think it's a good example of. I think if the viewers saw the in-depth discussion we had prior to playing that, we're sort of sitting here almost on 2 milk crates here, with just hoping we can both fit in on the screen. So there wasn't really much discussion about who was going to play what, where, and when in that. And to me, that's when music is at its best, because it's fresh for the players, and the audience really gets the chance to, I guess, sit in to the musical equivalent of the conversation we're having right now.
That's right. If we sat around and really worked at that till we get it right, we wouldn't want to hear it either.
No,
and
I
probably
agree.
People wouldn't either.
So, mate, I want to take you right back to the very beginning,
Okay.
before you played any instrument. What's your earliest memory? You were born in 1957, and we've already said that Gympie was hardly the music mecca. It certainly wasn't the Nashville, New York, London, or Los Angeles of the music world. What's your earliest memory as a child of having an interest in music?
Well, I'd say I was probably around about 4. The first thing I can remember is the pipe band, like the Scottish pipe band.
Right.
I remember we were down the street as a family. There must have been some type of a parade, and I was standing reasonably close to one of the drummers, and he started the snare drum, and I can still hear this sound to this day. It is so loud, even as I'm speaking to you now, I've got the memory of this sound. And I was hypnotised, like the Pied Piper. I started following the pipe band up the street, and later on the family had to try and find me. I just wandered off.
Yeah.
And it was hypnotic.
And it was very different. I mean, my early memories of that is there was no television.
No.
Man had not landed on the moon.
Yeah.
There was no such thing as video. All you really had was the local radio station, or there was a thing in those days called shortwave radio. It was very much the radio, and when we were kids, we didn't even have a record player in the early days.
No.
But one thing about Gympie, and probably a lot of smaller towns in that era, and we're talking here the very early 1960s,
Yeah.
is they would have a lot of community bands. And my earliest memory of music was similar to yours, of the main street of Gympie's called Mary Street, and of a Saturday night the Salvation Army band would be playing, or there'd be a band marching up and down, and that's my first memory of hearing music. And it's interesting that yours was similar.
Yeah.
The drummer in a
Yep.
sort of a bagpipe band, was it, or the bagpipes,
Yes,
the Scottish band?
Yes, yeah.
So, if that's your first memory of music, and you've been associated with music for 50 years or more, what is your definition of music? Like, you've spent your life in music. If someone asked you the question, what is music, how do you think you'd best respond to that question?
Well, there's many levels to that. It's a really interesting question there, Brian. Basically, you could go through the situation where people talk about its pitch in time and all those type of descriptions, and that's definitely correct. But let's go a little bit deeper, and I'd say that it's a language.
Mm-hmm.
As we know, people talk about it being an international language.
Yes.
To me, if I went deeper in that same direction, it's where human beings can connect at a very, very, very deep level, and you bypass all the things like religion, politics, race, all that sort of stuff. So to me, it's a way of communicating for human beings. They talk about music being like an international
Universal language.
Universal
Yeah,
language,
yeah.
I would say the universal language really for human beings is loneliness, and this is a way of people connecting. And when I think about it now, that would be my opinion of music now. It's a way where people, like a really advanced internet for human beings, where we can all connect. We know that human beings don't like working in isolation and living in isolation. So you can express things in music you just can't with words, as far as that's my...
It's interesting, one of our very first influences musically, I think you would agree, was the great Herb Albert.
Absolutely.
And Herb talks about, for him, and there's a number of really good podcasts out there now where there's interviews with Herb Albert, and you actually get to hear it from himself. But the trumpet for him was a way of him getting over his shyness. He said he could play, he could express himself on the trumpet in ways that he could never do with his voice. So I think you're saying similar things there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, very shy kid. I spent most of my first 2 years at school outside the classroom.
Okay.
Right? Because we had this teacher who was really
just
probably quite nice.
The defamation laws, I'm not too sure of
No.
how long they last. So if we don't name the teacher, Mike, but yeah, okay, yeah.
But and this teacher was really quite nice to me. But the thing is, I'd be so upset, essentially, that if you were sitting next to me at school, honestly, you're in danger of I'd be throwing up everywhere. So it became like a situation where, you know, for the safety of everybody concerned, they'd put Mike outside. But I wasn't allowed to go home. So what I did was they'd leave the door open so I could listen to the classes outside. And because what I was doing was looking everywhere else. But I had lots of problems as a child, as far as like getting over things like that. So the music was definitely always very comforting.
I think for a lot of people, I think for a lot of really good musicians, music was the answer that they were looking for years.
Yeah.
You've said something before which was really important, that you could communicate with people in a language where they may not speak your language. And if I fast forward for I don't know how many years, but my earliest memory of really seeing that happen was when we were playing as the resident group at a jazz club at Budrum here, which was a very popular jazz club on the Sunshine Coast. And I remember in that era, tourist buses of Japanese tourists would come.
That's right, yeah.
And we'd often be playing to a room full of international people who did not speak their language. And I can always remember at the end of the night, you know, someone from Japan or an Asian country that could not speak English at all at that stage, beyond an attempt at hello or goodbye, would come up and shake my hand and smile, and sort of you just knew they were appreciative of what we had said to them musically, even though we couldn't even say hello to them. So I think the universal language is spot on. One of the questions I'm most often asked from students of the many instruments that I play and teach is, were your parents musical? Now, we shared the same parents, and sadly we lost our parents more than 2 decades ago, so it'd be great to ask them this question. But what's your recollection if someone asked you, were your parents musical? How do you think you'd best answer that?
Well, certainly Mum was. I remember we had a very out-of-tune piano. I can certainly vouch now it was definitely out of tune, but it may have been more in tune before it was moved to the house. But basically, from what I know, is that Mum used to sit in at the dances. The lady who was the leader of the orchestra, she'd like to wander off and have some liquid refreshments from time to time, just raspberry cordial, I imagine.
Yeah.
And so Mum would actually sit in and play the piano for however long.
And this was the era, again, for our listeners, people watching this all over the world. Look, it's fair to say that I think Australia in our parents' time, and certainly in our time as kids, was probably, I was going to say 10 years, but I think realistically 20 years behind the USA, and you know, in most things, 15 to 20. Sydney. Sydney was probably 10 years behind, and Brisbane was 5 years behind that, and Gympie, God only knows how many years. It always felt to me like Gympie was another 15 years. So if you add all that up, we're back in the Old Testament time.
Right, 100 years.
But you know, when the world was into rock and roll and cabaret and all that sort of stuff, Gympie was still very much into old time dances. And for those of you playing at home, if you Google terms like Maxina, Pride of Erin, Gypsy Tap, Foxtrot, Barn Dance, you'll learn a bit about a bygone era, an era when men and women would hold each other when they danced instead of being in separate rooms, and musicians' primary function was to play music for people to dance to, not to listen to.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Mum, when Mike's talking about Mum playing at the filling in at the dances, it's that type of music playing. So you know,
that's right. And I also another thing about Mum that I remember is that apparently across the road from where she grew up, there was a music teacher, and the idea was that she was supposed to take lessons there, and she took some lessons, but from what I understand, Mum was a rebel. She didn't want to play scales, she wanted to play tunes. So,
yeah, and that's interesting, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I remember that too. I remember Mum saying she absolutely hated the piano lessons. And again, a different era, that's when you'd be rapped over the knuckles with a ruler if you played the wrong note. And nowadays you'd be up on about 16 different charges if you even attempted it. But it was a completely different era. And look, while we're talking about this, we'll put up a photo here of Mum and Dad together at a holiday that they were sharing at a beautiful place here at Caloundra, Kings Beach, Caloundra. And there's also another photo, Mike, of you and me with Dad on a boat. Dad used to love the, I think they were the tea boats or whatever,
T-boats,
at what is now called Noosaville, on the Noosa River, and he'd take us out many a time.
I remember it running out of petrol one time.
Many a time. And I think Mum was ready to throttle him on numerous occasions, but Dad loved the idea of the challenge, the mechanical challenge of trying to get I think it was a one-stroke motor. I don't think it was even a two-stroke. Trying to get it to work. So there's a photo there. I'm 2 and you're 6 there with Dad and Mum and Dad together. What about Dad? What's your memory of Dad's self-confessed music knowledge, or how would you describe Dad's background in music?
What the whole world needs. He was really an audience.
Yeah,
we all need to play, and we all need to play to somebody. His claim to fame was that he could play a record player, eventually, and a radio player. And, but always incredibly supportive.
Oh, absolutely.
Both
100%.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's a little bit about the environment in which you were born into, and whoever that snare drummer was that got you interested, thank you very much. We pass on our thanks to you, because Mike may not have pursued music if you didn't scare the living daylights out of him with your press roll with the band there. What's your first memory of being interested in the guitar? What's your earliest memory of actually being attracted to this instrument called the guitar?
Well, the funny thing is, I have a suspicion that it was due to the television show called The Monkees. Now, I know for certain later on, but I'll just back a little bit. I used to actually make guitars. Now,
it's true, yes, and this is a good story. Tell us about this.
I started off. Well, I made 2 models. One was a Fender and a model, and one Leo Fender wouldn't recognise it though.
No, he wouldn't have.
And I wouldn't have any trouble with patents or anything. There's no resemblance at all.
No.
But, I made a Stratocaster style guitar. I put a whole lot of effort into this. I painted and everything.
With house paint?
And varnished it, the whole thing. It was really cool, and it must have taken months to do.
Yeah.
I had 1 or 2 basic flaws in the design, in that I had fishing line strings going through. When I was looking at the photos on the Monkees records and that, what I didn't see when the strings were going across the pickup, I thought they were actually going through a metal thing, not over them. So that was a little bit of a design problem.
Right.
So I had a steel plate, and I drilled some holes in it and put the fishing line through.
It didn't last that long, I remember, when you strum it.
About 3 strums.
That's
but
right.
And I really hadn't quite got the Shower or Grover machine head situation up the top. So to replace one of those strings, you'd be into the pits for quite a while. And
I vaguely remember that the other guitar, which wasn't the Fender, was actually sort of a forerunner of the Gibson design, wasn't it?
It was made a Mason light. It was an F-hole one, and same problem with the...
I just remember as a kid how heavy these guitars were. I'm thinking, if he ever strings this around his neck, he'll kill himself.
No.
It was never really performed within the normal playing mode from memory, certainly not standing up.
No, it's more like lap steel, but anyway, didn't get to putting a strap on.
No.
That was probably a good idea.
So this is amazing that long before, well before you ever received your first guitar, which I understand was on your 13th birthday,
13th birthday.
And that was a $15 Tempo acoustic guitar?
No, $17.
17, was it?
That's it.
17.
Really
okay, from Chewton's Music Store in
right.
Mary
Eric
Street.
Chewton.
Eric Chewton. So, but before you got that guitar, in your mind, you had obviously been focusing on this concept of a guitar, so much so that you, and I only stop to think what our parents must have thought, particularly Dad, when you're hacksawing away at this massive, like, plank of timber. It's a credit that our parents let you just run wild.
Well,
with
see,
that.
the thing is, quite interestingly, Brian, is that now that's I'm about, say, 10 or 11 when I'm designing these guitars. But if I go back a little bit before that, you know how at school they'd always ask you, what do you want to be when you grow up, like around the class thing. Now, this is a really important point. I said, this is I think probably whatever, I'm not sure what grade it is, but I said, and they got to me, they said, and what do you want to be, Mike, when you grow up? And I said, a guitar player. The whole class just fell apart. And the teacher particularly, I thought we'd have to resuscitate the teacher. She was on the floor in stitches, so there's not getting any support there. I'm looking at the entire class, because this is when you're supposed to be, you can't be a guitar player.
This is when you're the fireman or the policeman or the doctor or the dentist. And
the next year they asked the same thing. So I said the same thing, because that's what I wanted to be. I knew that's what I wanted to do.
I think this is a really important point in the conversation, because earlier on we heard you play some amazing solos, one in your 20s and one at age 64. But to me it seems like, and from that photo of the centrefield photo of you at 2, it seemed like you always knew what you wanted to do, that is really what you wanted to do. But I need to stress for our viewers that in the 1960s, when Mike was at school, there was absolutely no such thing here in Australia, in Queensland, and certainly not in Gympie, as a music program. It was just, music was, you know, it was mathematics, it was English, it was sport, and that was it. There was a token art class that we often did, and Mike and my school experience is sort of 4 years apart, but and we'll get to it a little bit later on, but you know, 6 years after you left school, or 4 years after you left school, we both went to the same school, which in the 1960s was a Catholic college here, and it was sort of, you either went to the state school or in those days a Catholic school in the town we were in. But it was only, you know, 4 years after you left that a teacher came to the school who actually supported the idea of music. And while there was no music program, it's a great story that we got introduced to some amazing musicians as a result of a teacher who came to Gympie from Sydney and was a little bit, I guess, horrified to see that there was nothing musical at all in any grade in that school. So I have a memory of you, and it might be false, but of some guy sitting on stairs, the front porch or something of a house here on Elizabeth Street.
That's right.
Is that right?
Yeah,
that you went past and there was some guy, often who'd just be, I imagine, it'd be horrendous. I only think what he was strumming.
No.
But
Well, see,
you remember that?
The interesting thing is, even just before I get to that, the interesting thing is the next year that asked what you want to be, and I'd say the same thing, and it was even worse, because I think they were sort of waiting for it. Anyway, one more year, I'm thinking the next time around, I'm going to say something different. Now, in my mind, I was determined that guitar is what I want to do. So the third year was really good, because I said a swimmer, and then they all start laughing again. I said to the kid next time, I'm just trying to work this out. I'm thinking, what's the problem? And he said, you can't swim. And I'm saying, so? Because the thing is, like, I mean,
you had to say something. I said I want to be a helicopter pilot because there was a show here, Skippy the Bush Kangaroo, and I thought the helicopter pilot had a good job. What I didn't know at the time is that George Gola, who is an amazing jazz guitar legend that Mike got to play with and got to know quite well, actually George played the banjo in the theme music of that. It was probably the most popular show on Australian television, Skippy the Bush Kangaroo. So I wanted to be a helicopter pilot, but you always wanted to be a guitar player.
Right, so fast forward to what you were just talking about before. This idea is still in the back of my mind about guitar, right? So it comes up to my 13th birthday. It was Thursday, and Mum's driving me to school, and she said, what do you want for your birthday? See this guy who was on the boarding house, he's on the front stairs playing a guitar. And I said, a guitar, because it resurfaced again, this whole guitar thing. And she said, okay. Now this I remember very clearly, is that it comes Saturday on my birthday, and I got a watch and a guitar. One incredible birthday.
For your 13th birthday.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Never forget it. Now, then, I thought, fantastic. And I remember it was in a cover box, I remember taking the lid off and just strumming across it. And I thought, this is amazing. It's probably all out of tune. But I just thought, what an incredible sound. It just hit me. Like, you know. And then the interesting thing is, and then Mum comes and says, and we've got another surprise. I'm thinking, like, holy heck, I've got a watch and I've got a guitar. I can't possibly even cope with anything else. And she said, you're going to go to lessons this afternoon. I thought,
here we go. Here we go.
No.
Formal lessons. You just wanted to, I imagine, just strum it like the monkeys, your heroes on TV.
All I want's the guitar.
Yeah. And this is a really important point because I wanted to ask you whether after all of these years and all the interactions with different people, whether you consider yourself as largely self-taught, or if someone asked you, you know, how did you become the guitar player you are today, you know, how would you answer that?
Yeah,
do you think largely self-taught?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've been influenced. I've had a help from a lot of really good people. But as I said in the opening, I got to find out that I really couldn't play like anybody else. A really funny story is one of my heroes was Don Andrews, a guitar teacher and player.
Yep.
And I remember in his book, because I wanted to do everything properly, I remember I had to hold a pick. And at that stage, I was already playing.
Yep.
And the way it said to hold the pick was different than the way I was holding it. So I decided I'd do everything correctly. And I was working out how to hold the pick like it had in Don's book. And years later, when I met Don, because this set me back at least 18 months, I couldn't play hardly anything.
Yeah.
So I got it because I'm trying to think about doing everything properly. Yeah. And so I met Don, and then in one of the lessons I said, Don, this thing about a pick, because it was just bothering me like mad, you know. And I said, like, how do you hold a pick? He said, however it feels comfortable. And I'm thinking, damn, it's got in your book, you've got to hold it like that. He said, no, whatever way feels comfortable. He said, we've got to put a picture in the book. But
yes.
So
it's a really interesting thing because a topic, you know, our listeners want to get inside of the music mind of great players, and I think there's a term that really applies to you, and that's self-directed learning. When you think about it, the only teacher that you were forced to go to, that you didn't make your own mind up to go to, was your first guitar teacher. Is that correct?
Absolutely, and it turned out to be the very best thing to ever happen to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want to talk about your first guitar teacher now? And I witnessed this from the sidelines. Mum would take Mike to the guitar teacher whose name was, I think, John Hodgins, but everyone called him Bunny. Is that correct?
Yes, back in those days they had all interesting names. You'd have my first teacher was Bunny Hodgins. You'd have all guys like Chooky Mallet. They'd all have these.
It was the era of the nicknames.
That's right.
But I remember, we'll use the name that he was known by, Bunny.
Yep.
I remember Bunny had a flat at Wickham Street here in Gympie, right on, you know, busy intersection. So there was a lot of noise, and I don't think him teaching music there was ever a problem, because there'd be the sound of semi-trailers and whatever out the front. But Mum would take Mike around, and she'd also, not always, but sometimes she certainly encouraged me to come, and we'd just sit in the lounge room while you had your lesson, you know, at a table in a sort of a dining room, I suppose, of the flat. Tell us a bit about Bunny and your your memories of going there, and what he meant to you as a teacher, and how he inspired you to play beyond what you would ever have played, likely, in Gympie at that time, on your own.
Absolutely. Well, I'm sure things would have turned out far differently if I hadn't run into Bunny. Bunny was a real player. That's important. He was actually a player first. Yeah. And to sit a little bit further than we are apart now, across the road, across the desk
table,
basically,
from him.
And to hear these notes firing out at you was absolutely like the second. This is like after the pipe band drummer, bang, that's in there, and the sound of Bunny's banjo is in here too.
Absolutely.
It's just astounding, and talk about inspiring.
Yeah.
Remember that I was very shy, didn't want to go to the lesson, so I'm trudging up to the first lesson. Bunny would have been around about my age,
I
maybe
think
62 when I went.
We thought he was the oldest person on the planet
was.
at the time, but I'd say he was our age or
60
younger.
is very young, folks, if you're listening in.
That's right. I do remember, but I also remember that he was very fit and always well dressed.
Absolutely.
And he was a performer.
Absolutely.
In fact, Mike, we'll play a little video here of Bunny improvising on the banjo, just so that our listeners can get an idea. Bunny come from the vaudeville era, from the pre-PA era. So one of the things that I remember about him was how loud he could play that banjo.
Absolutely.
It was like, what I imagine hearing Louis Armstrong in his prime was like that. It was just a bigger-than-life sound. Have a listen here. This is Bunny on banjo.
Okay, so the first thing that Bunny did, he pulled out this Cole's Nick Maniloff Spanish guitar method.
Yes.
And I didn't know what was going to happen. And halfway through the book, I can't play Spanish guitar or anything like that. We only used about 10 pages in the middle of the book, which was how to read the notes, and that was fantastic. So right from the very first lesson, Bunny taught me how to read music. And apparently I was about the second last guy that he taught to read music. He just couldn't be bothered with it after then because it was, I guess, too much bother or whatever. He didn't want to do it. So I was very fortunate. I got over the fence there with that. And the strings were really hard for me to press down, but I really enjoyed the lesson. I was terrified, but I walked out thinking, yeah, I'd like to do that again, rather than like my impression was I was just going to go there, put up with it, scream my head off and never have to do lessons again. That was my attitude going into it. On the way back, I'm thinking, no, I'd like to do that again next week. And after about the second lesson, Bunny brought out a piece of music called Dear Heart, Henry Mancini.
Yep.
And we started playing tunes. Now, this is the second week, and I was playing it just very tentatively, but I was starting to get a sound out of it. Then, this is where the self-directed learning thing comes in. We had a record player by that stage, and we were listening to a single by Glenn Campbell called Try a Little Kindness.
Absolutely, yeah.
So we head back down to the music shop where we'd bought the tempo guitar from, and I must say too, about in those days, what would happen, you'd walk in, they'd have sheet music, and I remember Eric Chewton was the person who owned the shop. He played piano accordion, and I remember his daughter was Jan Chewton. Now, the interesting thing is, you would go up and you'd have a look, you'd select a piece of music, and Jan would come up and say, do you want to hear that? And she would go over the piano and play that.
Yeah. And isn't that amazing that, I mean, that's the real universal language, the conversation of music. She had the skill, because she could read music, of turning black dots on a white bit of paper into sound. And then you decide whether you wanted that piece of music or
and
not.
if not, she'd take out another one.
Yeah.
And that was a great sales thing, but it was fantastic. What I'm saying is, all the time you're seeing music happening right in front of you, live, people doing it in front of you, person playing the piano, and I'll never forget that. So we had this, we had the record at home, Try a Little Kindness, and I thought we'd take that around to Bunny because we'd like to play that song. So we took it around there, but what I'd heard, remember this is about 4 weeks all up into the lessons, and I heard this sound. The part that I was really disappointed about after we got the music, I thought, damn, the bit I really like is the intro. I mean, I like the whole song, but the bit I really wanted to play had this great intro, and it didn't have it in the music. So I'd worked out how to play it on the guitar, so we went around by ear. Or I don't know how, but I just I knew a couple of chords, and the ones I didn't know I sort of filled in where they might be. So we go around to Bunny, put the piece of music, and he thought, well, that's nice. This shows he's sort of self-motivated. So he's ready to count in. He counts 1, 2, 3, and he's ready to play where the tune starts, if you see your brother standing by the road. So I just launch into this introduction, and then he just stops. And he's totally dumbfounded, and he gives me the look, and it just scared me. I'm thinking maybe, oh, hang on, I shouldn't be doing this. So it put me off doing that type of thing for a long time. But looking back now, I don't know how I worked it out. But
I can remember, and yeah, and I think there's a number of points there. Again, thinking of the music mind, my memory of your lessons was that it was 90% playing and 10% talking about a scale or a chord. It was very much like a half hour or more of playing with a good player. Is that your memory?
Absolutely.
Largely of the lessons?
I can't really recall us talking about scales. At that stage, my association with scales was fishes. Fish had scales.
Yep.
I didn't know anything about
I think that's really the opposite of how music is taught nowadays and has been for a long time. But that's my memory. It's funny you talk about the Coles Nick Maniloff book.
Okay.
My first memory of looking at that book was the smell, even though it was a new book, it smelt 200 years old. Right. And you had written, or someone had written, some of the names under the
Bunny had
notes.
written in, but unfortunately, because he came from the banjo, and I can sense now that the teaching guitar, it was more like economic reasons, because the banjo was not
banjo
as
had its
back
time,
then.
which is sad, because he was a great banjo player. But what I was saying with the book there, I was horrified at those low E's.
Oh, I was too.
And it's funny that years later I took up the clarinet, and the lowest note on the clarinet is actually the same as the lowest note on the guitar. And if you want to play the clarinet was largely a reading instrument rather than an improvising instrument. You just had to learn to read those. So I remember 15 years after being scared about that Nick Maniloff book, those low E's suddenly, an F and F sharp and G, and that suddenly becomes second nature to me. But I definitely do recall you working through that book.
Well, it was always debatable whether it was E or G. I knew it was one of them, like down low in the ledger.
Yes,
things
that's
like that.
exactly right. Look, an interesting thing there is that on the clip we played of Bunny playing the banjo, that was actually you playing the rhythm on the second banjo, which I really don't ever remember. I do remember you having a banjo. In fact, we'll put up a photo now of some of our early equipment in the TV room, and you'll see 2 tempo guitars, because my entry into the guitar world came when Mike upgraded from the acoustic guitar to an electric. So like most younger brothers, I inherited what Mike had outgrown, and my memory of your $17 tempo is that it had an action that you could literally run a Mack truck through. And I was, when I've actually got it, I think I was 8 going 9. I can still, to this day, I still think I've got the cuts in my index finger where blood would spurt out when particularly when you'd try to play the first position F chord
I've got the same.
and have a fair dinkum go at it. I often think nowadays when people say, Mr. Hayes, my hand's hurting, I just sort of think, I wished I had that $17 tempo guitar to give to them. But if you have a look at the photo that we've got on the screen there, you'll see the 2 electric guitars and not the original tempo, but it must have been your upgraded tempo acoustic. And over on the left, there's Mike's banjo. What brand banjo was it? Do you remember anything about it?
No, I can't. I think it might have been a tempo 2. It didn't have the whatever the name had fallen off.
Okay.
And unfortunately, with banjos, you've got to have a good quality brass or metal hoop widths, because that's what gives it the snap. And this was just tragically bad. But,
it was a very limp sounding banjo.
No matter what you did. And I was always comparing the sound of that banjo with Bunny's, which was just phenomenal. But of course, again, it's mostly from Bunny that the sound came from. But Bunny used to show me how to change the vellums, that's the skin, the head of the banjo. Showed me how to cut the bridge, so you'd cut it so it come to a point, so you'd get a sharper sound, and all little things like that, which was really just definitely old skills. And on the same topic, we never thought about having a guitar set up. I mean, like, we just thought that's how hard, that's what you got to do, man. If you want to play the F chord, you're going to have to work at it.
It's so true, and we'll be paying a bit of a tribute to people who have helped us over the years with repairing of instruments as part of this podcast. But I just want to go back to, I vaguely remember you playing the banjo. So in essence, this was the start of your journey as a multi-instrumentalist. Most people who know you totally associate you with the guitar, but what dragged you or caught your attention about the banjo? Why did you end up playing the banjo for a period?
Well, the banjo didn't attract me.
Right.
What actually happened is, remember we had like limited opportunities in those days, as we've said. So after 18 months, Bunny said, look, I've taught you all I can on guitar. But the thing is, I still wanted to go to the lessons. I really enjoyed the lessons. And so the thing was, well, there's one way to keep going to the lessons, is that how about you learn banjo? So that sort of was put forward, that idea at home.
Okay.
Both mum and that. So it wasn't my idea with
No.
the banjo. In fact, I'll be honest, all the way through, even though I've played other instruments, I've always felt that it took time away from the guitar. Now, it actually has been a big advantage playing these other instruments, but at the time, really, I've been just single-minded guitar all the time. So, but the banjo was a wonderful thing because I'd get to go out and we'd play the CWA morning teas. That's Country Women's Association. That we have,
and the aged homes and everything. It was my memory is that you and I played, you know, hundreds of free sort of gigs where. And your teacher was largely responsible for that, because he'd drag you out and sort of say, you know, I'm playing Wednesday night or Wednesday lunch for the pensioners or something. Come along. So if I just in summary, you know, go back there, you always were attracted to the guitar. You were building your own guitars. And I just wish we had photos of that stuff. And, you know,
Me too.
Our parents were essentially... well, our father was essentially non-musical, and our mother come from a very casual, amateur, fun approach to music. I think that's an important thing too, because, you know, whilst we're having a serious discussion here today, I think you and I have really enjoyed many, many aspects of playing music, and we can get serious and play some serious music, but we also have had a lot of fun through it. Our music has brought us a lot of fun. That's my experience.
Absolutely.
Is that, would you agree with that?
Always.
Yeah.
Always fun.
So as far as self-directed learning go, I think what I'm taking from that is you initially didn't like this idea of going to a teacher. You just wanted to have fun with the guitar.
That's right.
But you struck gold with an amazing teacher.
Yep.
And something you said just a minute ago I think is really important. Your teacher actually had the courage to say to you, I've taught you everything I know about the guitar, because the guitar was very much, for Bunny, very much a second instrument.
Absolutely.
It wasn't his thing. It was just like he was from a bygone era, and the instrument of his choice, the banjo, absolutely was once a very, very popular instrument.
Actually,
but the popularity waned with the demise of vaudeville and all of that sort of stuff. I think that's really important for people out there who are wondering whether to take lessons or lining up with a teacher. My experience sometimes is that the partnership with teachers can really outgrow its usefulness.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's a rare situation for a teacher to actually say, hey, you know, I think it's time to move on.
Yeah.
So, Mike, as well as the banjo, I believe there was also a period where you took some piano lessons or delved into the world of the keyboards. Tell us that story.
All right, so I'm working in a music shop teaching guitar there, and very, very important people there, Earl Anderson and Maureen Anderson. Earl was very far-sighted, had a lot to do with the Yamaha Corporation in America, and Maureen was the first real musician that I saw could work things out by ear. I saw a witness that a kid come in one day with a cassette, and he said, I'd like to, this is part of his lesson. I'm up trying to clean the guitars and wipe them down, and I'm looking at this happen in front of my eyes. And I've never seen this happen ever. But this guy says, look, I'd like to work out this one. This was part of his lesson, so obviously they did it regularly. He just put the cassette on, and Maureen had to listen to the song, and then she just played it for him and showed him how to do it.
Great.
It's a party trick I'd never seen happen ever before that. But anyway, back to the music store. Earl said, look, you're teaching here, and Earl did a really good thing. He put ads in the paper, so it started associating my name, Mike Hayes, with guitar. Very important thing.
Yes.
And always presented it well, good photos and the whole thing. And he said, look, if you're going to teach, you're going to have to get you qualified. And I'm thinking, like, I don't know what that means, you know. So, and I didn't like the sound of it.
No.
I thought this is going to hurt. But anyway, what the good thing was, I didn't have to go to work. They'd keep sending me off to these theory lessons and music lessons. Thursday morning or whatever day, where instead of Mike, apart from teaching, they'd send me up to do these theory lessons. Well, a part of the theory lessons was I would do theory and piano with this particular teacher. So the piano lessons were quite interesting because she'd be teaching, say, about 4 or 5 people. She'd have a person on organ, so they'd have their headphones on. You'd hear this clack, clack, clack on the pedals. You'd have some people studying theory. And then when you went over to piano, you'd actually had to put coins on the back of your hands. And this technique, I couldn't work out what that was about. So you'd go over there, but what it was, and I found out very quickly, is that when the coin fell off, it meant you weren't having the correct technique. So you'd come over and they'd belt the heck out of you. So that was very encouraging with the piano technique.
Yeah.
But what really struck me is the theory. I was really interested. I got interested in the theory.
Yep.
And I remember we were playing in bands at night, and we were doing songs, like the that sort of sound, right?
Smoke on the water.
Smoke on the water. So we get into the theory, and so I thought, okay, there comes up this question here. How would we deal with the chord progression in the key of G? And I'd written down G, B, flat, C, because we were playing that Smoke on the Water or AC/DC or whatever. And then I got pulled up with that. I got marked wrong there, and it was like, no Michael. Now, when they call me Michael, I always know I'm in trouble.
Yeah, that's right.
So instead of it going like this, how I was told it should correctly go is... You can imagine that on Friday night.
Beautiful.
A pub full of that would have went really
Beautiful.
well.
It's because, in other words, some of those chords, B flat isn't in the key of G, and they wanted you to use harmonised chords.
You'd get other questions, and they'd write, can you have parallel fifths? Well, of course, that would be say a power chord in guitar things.
Yep.
And people like Eric Clapton had that, and you have that going all the time. So the question was, can you have parallel fifths? And I wrote, because I'm playing that all the time.
Playing that all the time.
No, and you can't.
Yeah.
In the theory, the classical theory, there's no way in the world for the exam. So this really bothered me. It didn't work out for a long time that there's actually 2 types of theory. There's theory from the street, which you can't explain out of a standard theory book. And it bothered me because I couldn't work out what's going on. So I would play what I heard, but then I have to put on a different hat when I do the theory exam, otherwise I get marked down. So this really did bother me.
So did you eventually just walk, or how did you did get some theory qualifications?
Yeah, no, they did. And of course, to top it all off, the person really thought I should be super qualified, so I ended up overqualified because there was an Australian Music Examination Board exams for theory, but because this person also came from the background of Trinity College in London, they thought at the same time it'd be good for me to do those. Now, the 2 exams, so I'd get grade 1 and they'd have different questions, and they'd have different Italian terms and all this sort of stuff. So basically I got so confused out of the whole thing, and honestly, to be perfectly honest, I've never used it.
No.
I don't. I could draw notes. I copied notes out from the lessons with Bunny. So the things like, was this a 2-beat note? I already knew what that was. And the techniques, I'm not saying that it's not useful, but it's not part of my world and hasn't been.
Not the way that you play or teach.
Or work. Yeah.
So, Mike, that's you had a brief foray into the field of being a banjo player.
Yep.
You did some classical music theory lessons and actually a little bit of classical piano by the sound of it.
Very brief.
I just want to, for our viewers, show this album. This is, to this day, probably my favourite tenor sax album of all time. It's the great Boots Randolph on an album called Sentimental Journey. But this is critical in my music career. But my memory is of you lying in bed staring at that album cover, and I have a very clear memory of you with a Sherlock Holmes style magnifying glass. Can you tell me what were you focusing on with the magnifying glass on that album? What was that all about?
Well, you know how we came in contact with the Gibson and Fender guitars?
Yeah.
I thought I want to find out what makes that sound.
Yeah.
And it had Selma. And I thought, well, that's the one I have to get then. Selma saxophone.
So the entire decision, and you've got to remember that this is in the early 1970s.
Yep.
The chance of someone ordering a Selma Paris top-of-the-line tenor saxophone, at that stage it was the Mark 7. They'd just moved on from the Mark 6. I often wonder what they thought when an order come in from Gympie, Queensland, for a Selma tenor sax, the same as Boots Randolph was playing. But it's the best thing that ever happened, because I do remember your saxophone playing was unique in a way.
Yeah, originally different.
But what eventually happened is that Mike gave up the saxophone, and for fans of mine, those 2 million views on my YouTube channel, many on my saxophone videos, the tenor sax I play and have played for the last 40 years is the Selmer Mark VII tenor sax that Mike purchased based on what he saw with a magnifying glass on the instrument that Boots Randolph was playing.
Well, I taped myself one day here, and I think for the benefit of mankind,
I wish we could find
it. Yes. I thought the best thing is to hand that on to somebody.
But actually, it's a part of the self-directed learning. Mike really was not a good saxophone player, but it was interesting. You heard him say before that it was really just one of these diversions that he was finding his way back to the guitar. He kept playing the guitar all the time. But Mike always, and both you and I have always looked beyond the small country town we were born in, and Mike had the gall, dare I say, of sending a cassette tape of him playing. Was it the Spanish Flea? There was a classic. There was
a had a bottom B flat.
No, how does the Spanish Flea go?
It had a bottom B flat.
Yeah.
Is
that the Spanish Flea? I don't know. We've forgotten how the Spanish Flea goes.
There
Sorry,
you go.
Herb.
No,
but it wasn't that good. And Mike sent it to a guy called Peter Clinch in Melbourne, who was the top professor of saxophone in the classical field and could also play jazz. And he also sent it to Graham Lyle at a time when Graham was the music director at Channel 9 in Melbourne, and also you'd see him nightly on the Don Lane show. And credit to both of those boys that they actually didn't just fob you off. They invited you to, correspond with them. And we'll learn a bit more about that side of Mike's entry into serious music learning in a moment. But first of all, I want to get back to the music, and we'll play a clip here of Mike playing a contemporary country solo on the Fender Stratocaster. I come from a pedal steel sort of background. In fact, behind us, it's an unusual piece of furniture. Here we've got a 12-string universal pedal steel guitar just sitting there behind us, and I've spent a lot of my life playing steel. I actually hear heavy influences in Mike's playing of the great pedal steel players. Have a listen to Mike here playing a really good country solo in a contemporary style. Again, listening to that country solo we just heard, it actually doesn't sound like anyone else. That you could say there's influences there, but again, that very much to me sounds like Mike Hayes playing just with a different voice, the sound of a country sound on the guitar. But it still sounds like you. It doesn't sound like, Bucky Barrett or some, famous session guy in Nashville. And I think for those people watching this looking for how to find your own way in the music world and to have a really happy life playing, I think one tip you're already hearing from Mike is to be yourself. And we're going to look a lot more about the study that Mike has done. And I'm really interested in that. I love quotes, and the famous quote of "when the student is ready, the teacher appears." Absolutely. I think you've lived your life very much like that. But I just want to wrap up that multi-instrumentalist aspect, because your teacher, Bunny, actually was a multi-instrumentalist. He was, not that you or I ever heard him play, but he was certainly alleged to be a very good jazz trumpet player. But Bunny learnt the trumpet to play the trumpet in the era of the pressure system and had a lot of health problems because of just the way that he really didn't learn to play the trumpet in an effortless way. But my recollection is he played the trumpet, had a long history of playing the trumpet, the banjo, and then onto the guitar.
Yes,
so
you also had a great singing voice too, a lovely tenor voice.
A great singing voice. So your first teacher was a multi-instrumentalist.
Yep.
Having spent 50 years as a professional musician and having played some other instruments, what's your thoughts on a multi-instrumentalist approach to life versus zeroing in and spending your life dedicated to a single instrument? If you were talking to a young student who was 13 years old like you were when you took up the guitar, what sort of advice do you think, what's your opinion of playing multiple instruments versus dedicating a life to one instrument?
Well, I think it's an individual thing. It depends on the person, really. If you're going to do one instrument, like I'm just focusing on guitar, you have to be versatile. In Australia, certainly. I mean, I believe you can specialise in the US in like rock or jazz and that, but the real benefit for me has been that I enjoy playing a lot of different styles, and as I said earlier, the music will tell me what to play, but I really never felt comfortable on any of the other instruments. I've always had to work at the guitar too. I work at it every day, and I find it really hard. I don't find it easy at all.
That's a really important point, because most people who watch you play today and hear your recordings from 30 years ago would think that you're a natural, but no. My recollection is that I totally support what you said, that I've seen you in your youngest years really fight with that instrument. Yeah. It didn't come naturally to you. And you started comparatively nowadays very late in life on the guitar, like at 13. Yeah. I mean, the other day I was in the Brisbane Mall. I'm living in Brisbane quite a lot nowadays, and Brisbane is very much a world city nowadays. In fact, it's put in the bid and will probably win the bid for the Olympic Games in the early 2030. But in the Queen Street Mall, I'm just fascinated by you'll walk past a busker that's got soft drink bottles hammered into a broomstick, and his total skill is that he just taps the stick, clunk, clunk, and not many people are stopping to fund that guy's
only to get it off him
that soft drink bottle career. But you go 20 metres down the Queen Street Mall and you see a 7-year-old girl playing the heck out of a violin, playing Mozart violin concertos without the music to a public that is just, it's the factor of, isn't that cute? But when I walk past, I think, isn't that great?
Incredible.
This kid is playing as if she was a 40-year-old concertmaster of the Sydney Symphony Orchestra. So you didn't start, and for her to be playing that well at 6 or 7 years of age, this kid must have had a violin in hands from 3.
Oh, definitely.
And playing so much. But I think it's a really important thing in the music mind. Mike has become a master guitar player, but has had to fight his way to get there. And you've heard him say that he still has that little battle every day with the guitar. And I imagine some days the guitar wins and occasionally you do.
The guitar wins most days. Yeah. It does.
So your advice is it's up to the individual. I think you and me are classic examples of that. I've got a room full of instruments here, and it's a story for a whole other day. But my approach to playing multiple instruments is I've never been interested in being the best on any. In fact, I've never wanted to be a sax player or a flute player or a pedal steel player. I just hear different sounds in my head, and the only way I can express myself with those sounds is to play the instrument that fits that sound.
Well, I think that's the key there, Brian, because what I hear in my head most of the times are arrangements. So I don't, getting back to the country style and that, I think, okay, if it's a country song, what would be appropriate? That's what. And so you put on a little bit brighter sound on the guitar and a different tool. I only have a couple of guitars. I'm not a guitar collector. I'm a guitar player.
Absolutely.
But I would get the sound that's appropriate for a country song. But most of the time, what I'm hearing are arrangements. So I don't really, if I'm playing for myself, or if somebody said, "What do you like to do?" If I do solo guitar and jazzy types of things and that, It's always, I hear arrangements in my head and I try and find those sounds on the guitar. Now, there's the situation where we're both saying the same thing. You hear these different sounds, and thank God people like you play it, because if I'm doing an arrangement, I hear a flute, I can get a flute. You can play the flute there, or the baritone sax. That's the colour for the arrangement.
I think this is really important, and the great James Morrison, the very famous jazz trumpeter and multi-instrumentalist in Australia, basically says the same thing. He hears sounds. If I hear the Pink Panther, I own a tenor saxophone, your former tenor saxophone, I'm going to pick up the tenor saxophone. I'm not going to play that on the guitar.
Yeah.
You know, but it's important, what Mike just said before, I think, as far as the music mind goes, is that he hears orchestrations in his head. He hears the finished... I'm sure the way you play, you're not just hearing a single note guitar line when you play.
No, I'm hearing... This started from hearing, I'd have to say, that Oscar Waters across the road and these arrangements from the Pickwick Doc Severinsen records, they'd come firing across the road, and I can still hear that type of phrasing. And when I'm wanting to play something, if I picked up the guitar now, I'd be hearing phrasing like that. Yeah, and I'd try and emulate that.
I think this is really important, that Mike's sound, he plays the guitar different than just about anyone else you'll see play. If you listen, he sustains the notes, and I think you said that in a contemporary sense there was an album by the great Lee Ritenour called what's it called?
Feel the Night by Lee Ritenour.
We'll put that up on the screen for those who are interested. And what is it about that album? Because I must admit, when you're playing in a contemporary style, you absolutely don't sound like anyone. The notes are very full, they're very sustained. I've already talked about those massive bends that the guitar can be a pluck a duck type instrument to me, sort of as the piano can if it's not well played, where it's dink donk dink donk dink, no sustain. Or in a contemporary sense, the effects are trying to play the instrument rather than the player. True. But tell me more about Lee Ritenour. We've got that up on the screen for people, that album.
Okay,
tell us about that.
That's a sort of defining moment as well, because I would listen to that record practically every night. Again, for probably a couple of years, almost every night with headphones on, and it just blew me away. And I'm thinking, how the heck does he get that guitar to sustain that long? And of course, the hilarious part out later on, I found out that all the lead, the melody parts, the lead lines, were played in unison with the tenor sax. Ernie Watts played the tenor sax in unison with Lee's part, who Lee played with an overdriven guitar. Beautiful sound, terrific player, Lee and Ernie. But that whole record introduced me to people like Steve Gadd and people like that. That is absolutely... The whole record, I thought the arrangement, you'd have Chuck Finley on trumpet.
It's a fantastic record, folks. So one of the things with these podcasts, when we hear great players like Mike talk about players and albums and what have you that's influenced him, do some homework, check out these famous recordings, check out these players. If you want to play like Mike Hayes, you need to have in your head the types of sounds that he's got in his head, and you'll find your own way to play. But it's really important. One of the saddest things for me as a music teacher is, if I'm teaching a saxophone student for the first time, one of my first questions is, who's your favourite sax players?
That's it.
9 times out of 10, the answer is just a blank stare. I like the way you play, Brian. Well, hang on. You haven't actually heard me sort of play. Who other than me have you heard? And I think it's a real sign, if you ask that question of a good student, they say, I like John Coltrane, I like Stan Getz and Sonny Stitt. You think, well, hello, we're in for a ride here because this guy has got some, whether or not I think those references are good, he or she has got some really good professional references.
That's it, Brian. I really believe you create, a good player has audio references in their mind.
Let's have a listen to Mike. He just talked about Lee Ritenour in a contemporary sound. Let's have a listen to Mike again with his Fender Strat, playing a contemporary solo here. that's a great sound, Mike, on the guitar there. Everything we've been talking about, a very singing sound. It just doesn't sound like the mind of a guitar player. So I hope that doesn't disappoint you, having spent your whole life focusing on guitar. But really, folks, Mike does play in his own way. It's a very melodic way. I read a quote, I love quotes. Recently I read a quote where the great Jerry Bird, and we'll talk a little bit about Jerry Bird in a moment when we talk about some of your memories of performance, but someone asked Jerry Bird, what's the most important qualities in music? And everyone would be thinking, well, the music theories, pitch, duration and intensity, and Jerry said melody, melody and melody. And I think that's lovely, because I think even if you're playing the rhythm instruments, if you play the chords in a melodic way, it just makes such a difference. So one of the greatest all-time lap steel players, that was his answer to what makes up music. Yeah, mate, I want to go forward now to your performing career, and I certainly shared many moments with you in performing. I want to take you back to, what's your memory of the very first time that you played in public? And I remember standing next to you when we did this, but what's your recollection of the first time in public that we played anywhere?
All right, I think it was a place called White Scully. I think it was like a footy field.
Yeah.
And they had like a Fate or something on there. It had the back of a truck.
That's right.
And we thought we were pretty good, because we had 2 electric guitars, and we had
2 tempos.
2 tempos.
That's right.
Matching guitars, and a 12-watt golden tone amplifier.
And wasn't it golden?
Oh, it was golden.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget, we sat up there, and the sound guy said, well, do you want us to mic it up and stuff? And we're like, no, wait, stand back.
Yes.
We
look
got
after
all the
our
power.
own sound.
We've got our own sound here.
Amplifier there.
That's it. And this is a 12-watt amp outside.
And
you couldn't even hear it in the front where we couldn't hear it from the front of the truck.
All I can think is, all I'm thinking of is, what were we thinking? But there was a pride in we want to control our sound, and it's really interesting that that truck, by the way, as Mike said, was open back. It had neither a roof nor a back.
No size.
And this is a 100-metre by 80-metre rectangular open space. And as Mike said, I actually couldn't hear us. And the PA guy, and look, I've got to use PA with quotes there, because in this era the concept of a PA was literally those loud hailers, Dixie chickens here, and he just had the upmarket model of those. I don't even know whether he had stereo, whether he had 2 or just 1, because he'd drive around with that on a truck. So he was more or less the old time line tamer promotion for the circus man.
Absolutely. Yes, I think that was his other
but
gig,
the fact that we refused the help of the only chance we had of anyone hearing us was how we started our performance career. But I think
also an introduction to the music industry too, because during the break,
and just be careful again, we won't mention any names.
Disclaimer there.
But Mike and I received our first, I guess, payment for playing. Do you remember the terms of the payment?
The guy said, "That was great, fellas. Here, go buy yourself a drink." And he gave us, say, 25 cents. And this was for 2 drinks, and 1 drink was costing 45. So we were just short of buying 1.
We couldn't buy one soft drink with the money that we were paid. So we couldn't even share 2 straws with one soft drink. And I suppose that comes under the chapter, hello, welcome to the music business.
That's right. And it hasn't changed.
No. That's where we'll leave part 1 of this 3-part conversation, where we look into the music mind of one of the best, the great Mike Hayes, a 50-year career as a professional musician while living in his hometown, a small regional city in Queensland, Australia. To fade out, let's have a listen to Mike, the versatility of his playing, where he plays in a jazz trio setting, here playing jazz guitar with acoustic bass and acoustic drums.